All right, man, peace. So, brothers, I've been meaning to make a video on this segment from the show Speak for Yourself, captained by Mr. Jason Whitlock, for quite a while now. The topic is pertaining to whether or not rap music has had a negative impact on quote-unquote black culture. And of course, I say quote-unquote because, as many of you brothers who've been on my channel for a while know, I'm of the viewpoint that there is no such thing as black culture because there's no such thing as black. And I'm sure that a lot of people who are new to the channel or who've never heard me address this topic before will be quizzical, because I tend to attract a lot of so-called pro-blacks to my channel. And that's why I state that there are many layers of programming over the so-called black community that we have to address one at a time, because you'd be surprised. It's almost like somebody doing a detox or a cleanse. You have no idea how filthy your body is until you start to detoxify it. And then you'll find that all form of toxins and poisons have been floating around in your bloodstream and your bowels that you were just living with, and you had no idea that they were there. That's what's going on with the so-called black community when it comes to the levels of programming. We've been configured to venerate the divine feminine. We've been configured to be validated by other races. We've been configured to associate a color with a race, thereby cutting us off from any understanding of what we were before so-called slavery. Not even grasping that because of that, we've created a correlation within our minds that always associates quote-unquote blackness with slavery and quote-unquote whiteness with mastery. And nothing could be further from the truth. But just getting back to the point here, they had a very interesting conversation, once again led by Mr. Jason Whitlock. Marcellus Wiley also was on hand, Katino Mobley, the retired former NBA player. And they were speaking about the impact that quote-unquote rap has had on quote-unquote black culture. And just speaking about hip-hop or rap should be a video all in and of itself. But we have to understand something. What we call rap music today, or hip-hop music, is really post-crack epidemic music. And there has to be a separation made in the timeline of our existence in this society from the music before the crack epidemic and the music after the crack epidemic, because the crack epidemic had a very similar effect on the so-called black community as the dropping of the nuclear bombs did on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Very similar. And I'm sure that people might say that I'm being hyperbolic. No, I am not. It completely re-engineered the order that existed within the so-called black community on a hierarchy level. So before the crack epidemic, even though of course you had fatherless homes that existed before that, for the most part it was a patriarchy. After the crack epidemic that lasted from the late 1970s all the way through, you could say, the late 1990s, not only did the black community become a staunch black matriarchy, we were configured to worship the woman from a divine perspective. We now started to venerate the quote-unquote divine feminine. And that's an issue that has trickled all the way down to today, because the so-called black man has become so fond of putting his mother and his grandmother and his girl and even his daughter on a pedestal that it stops him from accepting the ruling class mentality that it's going to take for him to be accepted by all of these various demographics, including the so-called black woman, who knows subconsciously that even though her veneration feeds into her ego, she understands on a subconscious level that it's not healthy for her. So that takes us back to rap music. And Whitlock is going to address some of the components of rap music that he finds to be toxic, and they are to a degree. But it's a manifestation, it's an offshoot of that environment. It's not an excuse, it's just an explanation. So anyway, they're going to talk about it, and I'm going to chime in.
But Whitlock, I saw your tweets about rap music over the weekend, and you seem to believe that rap has had a negative influence on the black culture, and I want you to explain why.
I just think that rap music, commercial rap, the stuff that's mostly popular, it's just lyrical pornography.
I agree with that to a degree. But when we address things like that, I think that it would also behoove many of the more prominent members of the media, especially so-called black members of the media, when they make statements similar to what Jason Whitlock has just made, that modern day commercial rap is just pornography, meaning it's one of the lowest aspects, or it's meant to appeal to our lowest nature. For him to deduce that, and it's an accurate deduction for the most part, when you have the power to speak to many of the record executives or music executives to ask them, why is it that they're trying to propagate certain motifs in music that's aimed at black people? Why is that? Why do you have artists who state that they spoke to certain Caucasian record executives or Caucasian Jewish music executives, and they had their image totally contorted so that they could fit into a certain archetype that was going to be used to seduce the masses, starting with so-called black people and then trickling down to others? Why is that? When you have that ability to confront music executives, you should do that, because witchcraft starts all the way from the mountaintop and it trickles down to the people. That's why I did that video on Rihanna. I believe it was one of the Fire and Ice videos, where in the video there was a skit that she did on Saturday Night Live in which she stated that we are fire and ice taking over the whole world. From the mountaintops, she was speaking about or singing about, talking about what these witches are doing, these Saturnians are doing to pervert the mindset of regular people, of the masses. That's how people are being seduced into Luciferianism, is through the music. Music is enchantment, and being enchantment, it can be used to foster and reinforce certain themes in the minds of the listener, either for good or for evil, depending on the intent of the singer. All top level singers are witches, all of them. You cannot attain to a level of fame on a high level in the music industry without being a witch. Meaning what? You venerate Pan, you venerate the mother goddess, and you venerate the divine child, Heru, or Attis, or whatever you want to call him, Tammuz. All of them on a high level, that is what they're into. And a lot of times they'll try to mask it by becoming Buddhists. But Buddhism, when traced back to the furthest reaches of antiquity, is basically just a watering down of the Kemetic Babylonian mystery school system. Buddha is just Ptah. When you look up Buddha on Wikipedia or some other source, they'll tell you about a person who lived in the 6th century BC, so on and so forth. That is not where Buddhism comes from. Buddhism is, of course, an offshoot of Hinduism, and Hinduism, to be quite honest with you, is one of the more blatant derivations of the Kemetic Babylonian mystery school system, as all major religions are. But just getting back to the point, all of these top singers and entertainers are venerators of the mother goddess, the horn god, and the divine child. And that includes the hip-hop artists. Going back from the inception of hip-hop in the late 1970s, they were all high-level Masons. And that's why you'll notice that when hip-hop first started to become popular in the late 1980s with groups like NWA or Run DMC, they always wore all black because they were Saturnians. If you ever watch the video with Run DMC and Aerosmith, Walk This Way, you'll see that they were on the chessboard. And then Aerosmith broke through the wall because they were trying to help you understand that Aerosmith, which was a quote-unquote rock and roll group, they were straight up Luciferians. They were trying to show you that there was no difference between the top-level hip-hop artists and the top-level rock and roll artists. They all venerated Pan. All of them. NWA as well. Big-time Saturnians. And you could tell by some of the names. Many of the most popular rappers. Ice Cube. What is that talking about? That's talking about Saturn. Ice-T. That's talking about Tammuz. Ice-T is supposed to be some thug and some gang member. And every film that he's in, he plays a member of law enforcement. Why is that? I mean, you could put two and two together after a while. You can tell who some of the plants are in the hip-hop world because they allow them to stay relevant despite the fact that they're not moving units from a music perspective. They'll just throw them into the movie industry. That's what we saw with Ice Cube. And they'll always help him to stay afloat. Snoop Dogg, T.I., Common, those people, they're all pansexuals. They're all Luciferians. But just getting back to the point, hip-hop is an offshoot of the crack epidemic. So that time period was one of the most toxic in the history of the United States, especially for the so-called black community. That was the time period where they fractured the family structure and where they ratcheted up the prison industrial complex. Because in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, the black patriarchy was basically destroyed because now you were telling the so-called black man to no longer open up businesses and spend money in your own community. Now you're saying it's better if you go work alongside the Caucasian man in corporate America and give him your resume and hope that he gives you a job. So now you have to go to the same entity, the same people who have been oppressing you for a job. They don't give you a job. Now your woman has to look to some other channel to provide for herself and her child. That leads to disrespect in the household. Then in the late 1970s, you have the black female feminist movement led by Michelle Wallace, at least in the forefront. In the background, you had Gloria Steinem, the CIA operative. Gloria Steinem and Michelle Wallace, they combined to write a book basically to tear down the so-called black man. I believe it was called The Myth of the Black Superman. That came about in the late 1970s. And then at that same time, you had the introduction of crack as well as HIV, which destroyed the so-called black community all throughout the 1980s. So of course, the music that would manifest itself in that time period is going to be just as poisonous as the environment. And then when you combine that with the understanding that most of these dudes were witches and some of them were agents, of course, it's not going to have a good effect. Just listen to what it's called. It's called hip hop. In other words, follow the white rabbit.
Again, if anybody knows me, I'm not anti-porn. I just don't think it should be.
You know what? That's a bit too much information.
The basis of a culture. Larry Flint, Hugh Hefner, pornographers. That no one's called. That's not white culture. That's pornography.
I would agree with that, sir. And I've had this conversation with many so-called black people in the last 15 to 20 years who tried to state that hip-hop is a culture. Hip-hop is not a culture. All it is a music. But once again, for people to call it a culture, that's really just a way for them to confess that our people don't have a real culture. Especially in the aftermath of the crack epidemic, our people were left at ground zero. And we've had many, many manifestations of our brilliance, whether it's jazz or rock and roll or whatever, country music. These are all forms of music or genres of music that were created by so-called black people. We've never called these things a culture. It's only hip-hop that we've called a culture. And that's how you know that hip-hop is being masterminded in the background by the same entity that created the counterculture movement of the 1960s. That being the deep state Nazi implants that were strategically planted within the American infrastructure to see how certain strategies would impact society at large. Not to diverge off into another tangent, but for those of you who don't know, in the aftermath of World War II, many of the Nazis' top societal engineers and scientists were brought over to the Americas in an operation called Operation Paperclip, as well as Operation Rat Run. That's why starting in the 1950s, you started to see the promoting of rock and roll music. They were trying to see how they could use music to change culture. And then in the 1960s, you had the introduction of LSD and the promotion of marijuana for the first time. In many of these rock and roll bands, most of them were MK Ultra operatives or assets. 1970s, you had the development of rock and roll into heavy metal. And of course, the burgeoning black music scene. They had to figure out how to control the black music scene because the black music scene was extremely positive. Everything was about love. It was love music. If you ever listen to most black music in the 1960s and 1970s, it was love music. Many of them were Masons or Luciferians as well, but they were also promoting love in the music. It was only after the crack epidemic in the 1980s that the music started to become so antagonistic.
And something to be enjoyed mostly in private, in my opinion. A lot of the commercial lyrics, if you listen to it, it's just pornography.
Man, the older I get, the more I am married to what you just saying there. And I think our culture is too married to the rap culture, which needs to either get separated or maybe even divorced.
Well, here's the issue with that, Marcellus Wiley. Number one, once again, so-called black people need to come to terms with the understanding that we don't have a culture. We don't have a culture. And that's one of the most difficult things for our people to accept, because it's almost like someone who has come to a fork in the road and they've chosen a certain path and they've walked miles and miles and miles down that path and they realize that they made the wrong choice, but it's too late to turn back. Our people have embraced this concept of mixing Afrocentrism with woman worship, with fake activism, and while at the same time calling the so-called white man the devil, but I want to be equal to you. Why would you want to be equal to someone that you call the devil? And you're Afrocentrist, but you don't want to live in Africa, which is what you claim your motherland is. Our people have a lot of ideologies that are combative with each other. They just don't grasp that. That's how you know that we're not accepting that we have to start from a new foundation. We have to start from a new foundation. We have to scrap a lot of things, but it's going to take a lot of self-scrutiny, and most of our people are not ready to do that, and they're not going to be ready to do that until a mass traumatic event forces our people to humble ourselves and deal with reality, the bare bones of it, so that we can actually go on a path that's going to be fruitful. Because right now the path that we're on is a Luciferian path, and it's not fruitful at all. We're embracing a lot of Luciferian ideologies that are leading to our degradation.
More love. I'm a DJ. I got more love for the hip hop culture than hate, but I will say this. When I get disturbed by it, I like it because I live vicariously through their ignorance. I like the distance. Like, I'm not doing any of that, but you just told me that in art. Respect. But
well, sir, for you to say that you're living vicariously through their ignorance, what you're saying is that you're seduced by ignorance. That's what you're saying. So you still have not come to terms with the fact that you feel guilty that you enjoyed the music at one point in time. And don't get it twisted. You know, I still listen to hip hop to a degree. If I'm working out or something like that, if I'm doing an errand, I might listen to certain music that I listened to from back in the 90s, because it just does. After a while, it becomes a part of your person because you were heavily invested in it at a certain time period. But we also have to learn that if we're going to hone in on music today, we also have to do that same level of honing in on the music that we listened to back in the 90s, because it was just as off. If you listen to DMX, if you listen to Biggie Smalls, they talk about raping little girls. These are just facts. They talk about raping little girls on their tracks. And, you know, we too busy vibing out to the music, not understanding that we're being put under a certain level of mind control. So the question is, when are we going to be ready to divest ourselves of that mindset, or at the very least understand that it has to be marginalized? We can't call it the culture. We can't call hip hop music black culture, because basically what you're saying is that your culture is self-degradation or self-marginalization. These are just facts, and this is why other cultures or other nations are starting to ban hip hop music. Like in China, they don't fuck around. They're bringing heavy modifications on hip hop music, because the energy of so-called black people in America is so powerful and is so seductive that we'll have everyone listening to our music. And if everyone listens to our music, which is just a manifestation of our state of being, they're going to start to have a lot of the same issues that our people have. And these governments from these other countries, they understand that.
I hate it when I'm in my spin class and y'all dropping the N-word and you giving the license to every damn person around me to say the same
Why didn't you
thing.
tell me he was like Idris Elba? He a DJ, he just said.
Yeah.
I did not know he was a DJ.
Oh, yeah.
You gotta let us know so we can come
Stringer Bell's a DJ? Is that what
Oh,
you
yeah,
said?
Stringer Bell.
he's
Yes,
a
though.
he got songs and everything.
He about it. He about
He got songs.
Yeah, I'm
Listen,
doing it.
I'm so with you in this. Well, my son is 19 years old. He just turned 19. I have a 9-year-old son. I have to sometimes censor what my 9-year-old listens to, because my 19-year-old listens to some crazy stuff. I don't agree with it. Now, the guys...
Catino, knock it off, brother. You're a few years older than me, but we know that back in the 90s, we listened to some crazy music, okay? We listened to the glorification of murder, of thievery, of drug dealing. And it's not all our fault, nor is it all the fault of the artist per se, because once again, musical artists for the most part are pawns. That's why when I did that 3-part video, or that 3-part feature on Kate Smith and the nonsense around or pertaining to getting her music banned, or her version of God Bless America banned, most of these people, they're like monkeys. They get told what to sing about. It's very similar to an actor. They perform in a film that's not really them. They're given a script. They're told how to depict their character. In the same way, these musical artists, they get signed to certain labels, and the music executive says, okay, you have talent, but can you do this? Can you be a thug? Or they'll tell a female artist, can you sexy it up? You have on too many clothes. You're never going to sell that way. That's how they get them. They take these people who are very talented and who have a dream and who actually are in love with the art form of rhyming or singing, and they tell them, this is how it's going to be. You have to come through this portal, and you have to allow us to change who you are so that we can market you. And then the question is really going to become in the mind of the artist, what do you love more? Do you love the art more, or do you love the potential fame more? And that's how many of these people get compromised.
Love now that speak some logic, right? Is J. Cole, is Drake, right? Jay-Z. And when growing up, it was us. It was, you know, Ice Cube. No, I understand that. That's our culture. But all I'm saying is, it's a different.
That's not our culture.
But
Thank you, Whitlock. I agree with you, sir. Once again, this question is very big because there has been an attempt to obfuscate the difference between quote-unquote black culture and quote-unquote hip-hop culture. And you see what Katino Mobley tried to do. He tried to glorify certain artists who are more, as we say, lyrical. He started to talk about Ice Cube. Listen to Ice Cube's music. No disrespect to that dude. But he mixes in verbiage about the so-called white man being the devil and things of that nature so that he can hide what most of his music is actually about. Most of his music is actually about the degradation of quote-unquote black people. That's really what most of his music has always been pertaining to, especially during his time period at NWA. So that's what we tend to do many times. We like to glorify the people from our era as opposed to scrutinizing them in the same way that we do these modern day so-called artists. They're all pretty much the same. But to Whitlock's point, once again, black culture is not hip-hop culture because neither one is a culture. And in the case of black culture, that doesn't even exist. There's no such thing as black. That's not a culture. That's not a race. That's not a history. That's why when people use terms like black culture, they're normally talking about post-slavery culture.
J. Cole?
No.
No, he's smart. He's educated.
I don't like the rap now. That's all I'm saying. I don't like the rap now.
You know what's crazy?
J. Cole, Kendrick Lamar, I love those guys.
You just gave me something. My family knew the only way to motivate me was either to get me a cassette tape or take it away. That was my punishment.
Right.
My son has not heard a rap song yet because even the clean versions are dirty.
Right.
The suggestions are there. Even if they take out a curse word, they're still leaving in more than I want him to understand. He's 2 years old. It's just programming. It's unnecessary. There's a different way to do this.
Right.
I agree with you, sir. It is totally programming. Go back and listen to Suicidal Thoughts by Biggie Smalls. He's basically telling you that he's a Satanist, and that's how he got on. Biggie Smalls, Tupac Shakur, there's a lot that exists underneath the veils of those characters. Those people played characters. That's why it's so easy for them to transition into acting. Just think about it once again. How many of these rappers become actors? Reverend Run, he became an actor on TV, what they call reality TV shows. That's acting. That's an act. Ice-T, Ice Cube, LL Cool J, Will Smith, Tupac Shakur, DMX before he got cracked out. Ja Rule was trying it for a while. 50 Cent, Eminem, Ludacris in the Fast and Furious franchise. They all become actors. Why is that? Because their real life is an act. A lot of these people are not from where you think they're from. Oh, let me not forget Common as well. Right? Drake. All of these people are playing a role in their real life. That's why it's so easy for them to transition from being a quote-unquote rap star to an actor. Because the whole thing is an act.
Well, let's hear from the baby boy over here.
Listen, I disagree. Like, true, certain rap music has certain influences that can be negative. I'm not disagreeing with that. But at the end of the day, it goes down to how you're raised. So, for example, like, I've always listened to rap music my entire life.
Same.
But I'm not going to let a song dictate my action. So, if I listen to someone talking
Like
about
that.
Vicarious.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So,
like that.
you
But
got
that doesn't mean they should put it out there.
Darnell, let me ask you this though.
Yeah.
Honestly, you got a hell of a mama.
Yeah.
She put you in the church. You got some family support. Don't lie. Don't sit here and tell me you don't know some guys who take rap far more seriously than you and are influenced by it.
Absolutely. And those are called weak-minded people. And certain people might say, well, why should we worry about weak-minded people? You have to worry about them because when you have a ruling class mentality and you think like an administrator, you have to think according to the lowest common denominator in your society. Not what the strong people are going to do, but what the weak people are going to do. You have to make certain provisions that take them into account. Not the smart, sharp, astute people, but the dimwits. That's what we have to watch out for.
guys were going to do street stuff regardless of the music.
Not necessarily. I understand what you're getting at. You know, you have people who are definitely easy to manipulate. But that music certainly has a resonance. And that's why when you listen to it, the way that music is constructed is to deliver a certain message on a superliminal level and another message on a subliminal level. If you pay attention to the chorus is constructed in a series of chants. That's what permeates into your subconscious more than anything else. The 3 verses are really just meant to reinforce the programming that has been utilized through the chorus.
Listen to the music, trying to pump themselves up or whatever, but they was going to go that route anyway because they didn't have the guidance of a strong mother.
Well, brother, don't disrespect, but your statement is a part of the problem. The first thing that you stated is that those people were going to do what they were going to do anyway because they did not have the guidance of a strong mother. The first thing that you did was point out your mother as a guide. It's great if your mother is a quote-unquote wise woman or someone who points you in the right direction. But for the most part, the main issue in the so-called black community is that we venerate the feminine principle. We put the woman on a pedestal. And most of these children are programmed to not really listen to their mothers much past puberty. That's normally when the woman starts looking to the state or to the child's father to come in and provide correction, because she believes that she can do it all herself until the child hits puberty. And once the child starts to hit puberty and those hormones start to change and they begin to look at their mother less as an authoritarian and more just as a provider and a sponsor, they don't take what she says seriously, because I've stated this in previous videos. Due to the fact that the so-called black man no longer recognizes the Most High and his son as their head, the Most High has put the spirit on the woman to disrespect you. And in the same way that the woman now is inspired to disrespect you because you don't respect the Most High, the children do not respect the woman. So until we return to that order and start to show obeisance to the Most High and his son, there's going to be confusion everywhere. Because once you start to understand that the Most High and his son are your head, that's when you start to be able to distinguish between a wife material woman and a concubine material woman. Then we start making better decisions in who we're inseminating. And that's going to give us a better opportunity to change things that are going on in the so-called black community. Not by grabbing up signs and marching and blah, blah, blah. If you notice, most of those people who do that, they have no real solutions. And furthermore, if you pay really close attention, the way that the Caucasian super liberal has it structured, the leaders of all of these activist movements are always women. It's always a woman with the bullhorn. It's always a woman with the microphone, because they want the so-called black man to associate leadership with the black woman, because they know that the black woman is not a threat. They know that she's not a threat at all to topple their society. So whenever you hear a so-called black man say that the black woman is God, what he's really saying is that the so-called white man is his God, because the God of the black woman is this society. Do not let them fool you. I don't care how much they talk about race and all this other shit. Their God is this society, because most so-called races of color have the man as the head. Really, all of them have the man as the head, except for the so-called blacks of the captivity. And the so-called black woman of the captivity understands this essentially, that she can play this role of being pro-black and being pro-globalist and most of all being pro-feminist. And she could do this because the Caucasian who's in power is going to allow her to do that. He's going to give her that, that level of power, that level of influence in her own community. So we have to recalibrate our minds and understand what it means to be leaders. It doesn't mean that we denigrate the so-called black woman, but we have to understand how she's been trained. So once again, just getting back to the point, for this brother to say that, well, they were going to do that anyway because they didn't have a strong mother to guide them, that's not necessarily true. You have many mothers in these households that tell their sons, don't go out and gangbang, don't go out and sell drugs. But once they hit puberty, they feel like they don't have to respect the mother, because a lot of the proceeds that the mother receives are because she's living in the house with that child. So she's not going to kick the child out the house. She almost has to allow her disrespectful son and or daughter to stay there, because them being in the home has a direct correlation with how much funding she's receiving from the government. So once again, it always goes back to the so-called black man. We have to start looking at the so-called black man as the authority figure. But in order for us to do that, we have to return back to our rightful culture. So that's what I mean when I say there's so many levels to this problem. And that's why the so-called black man is a mocking. He's a proverb. He's an astonishment, so on and so forth. Everybody makes fun of the so-called black man, man. And it's because of our poor decisions.
Oh, right. Now, how about this one? He just said you had an amazing mom, right?
Yes.
All of us had amazing mothers. She put you where in church?
Yes.
Are all the pastors around this country doing the best they're supposed to do or not? Oh,
No, they are not, sir. And that's a great point. As a matter of fact, most of them are not doing what they're supposed to do. But that's a whole other video. But once again, that's a great point.
but I'm listening to that man every single Sunday because my mama told me to listen to him. And when I start seeing him do all this little crazy stuff, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to try to get away with it too someday.
Let me say this. And once again, Catino he's going off kind of on a tangent, but it's related to the issue. And that's due to the fact that he saw what Darnell did. He moved towards his mother, and he started talking about the prominence of a quote-unquote strong mother. Remember, the mother, especially the mother and the grandmother, they try to bring the child through the church system because they believe that the church can be a replacement for the father. They turn to the quote-unquote pastor, and there's not much that the pastor can do because most of these pastors, first off, they're not really men of the Lord. They're not really men of the scriptures. Most of them don't even know the Bible. Most pastors have never even read the entire Bible, believe it or not. They're there to play a role. It's almost like the film Indiana Jones. If you've ever seen it, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, near the end of the film, he's trying to claim the Holy Grail. And there's a knight that's sitting there guarding the Holy Grail who's been there for 800 years. And he can only leave it if someone's going to be there to replace him. That's how most of these pastors are. There are a lot of young men who grow up watching these pastors, and they learn how to conduct themselves based on the gesticulations and the way that the pastor expresses himself as opposed to understanding what the Bible is actually saying. That's why many of these women end up doing what? Sleeping with the pastor. Because they associate the pastor with knowledge. Women are drawn to knowledge and wisdom. It's just natural. So that's why it will behoove the so-called black man to make sure that his wisdom and his knowledge and his understanding are on a high level, so that you actually have something to teach the woman or answer her questions when she asks you questions about certain things. The scriptures say what? If the woman have any type of question, let her ask her husband at home. That's why when these bros jump in my comment section talking about, oh, how come you just talk to the brothers and all that? I tell them, what does your husband think? Because we don't do a good enough job of that as so-called black men. And when I say we don't do a good enough job of that, I'm talking about constantly making sure that the so-called black woman understands that her number one role here on this earth is being a good wife and a mother to a man. Many of them are all over the internet looking for attention from random men because they're not raised to be wives anymore. They're raised to be quote-unquote independent women. You understand? So when you start giving these random broads all this attention, that encourages them to keep doing it as opposed to sending them back to their man. Especially once you have a lot of life experience as a man. I mean, there's nothing that you really haven't seen. So it's like, okay, you're asking me these questions or you're claiming that I'm not giving you enough attention because of what? You really believe that your life will be validated by someone on the internet that you don't know. We have to start to grasp the importance of separating the internet world from the real world. It does not matter what people think about you over the internet. What matters is what's going on in your real life. Okay? If we focus on these things as men more, I promise you our lives will be better. And if we encourage that mentality in the woman more, their lives will be better. Because a lot of these broads, they on the couch sitting next to their man. Their man got a rock hard phallus. He wants some intercourse from his woman, and she too busy clickety-clacking on the internet with some random dude that she don't even know, arguing with some random guy on the internet. Meanwhile, her man is horny as hell. And then she gonna wonder why she get left 2 months from now. You're not paying enough attention to your man. Because I say this repeatedly, look, I worry about the opinion and the feelings of the woman whose vagina I came out of and the woman whose vagina I'm going into. That's it. I don't worry about random broads and their feelings. I don't care about how you feel about any topic at all.
It's a give and a take, so I agree with what he's saying. If you have a nice foundation, it don't matter what nobody says outside of that.
I agree, but Darnell, I just think if you listen to what's being said in the music, there's so much disrespect
It's
for women.
It is.
For
Well, that's a good point, brother. But here's my thing with the concept of the disrespect for women in hip hop. And it's certainly there. But it's very similar to the question of the chicken or the egg. I'll say this about the statements that have been made pertaining to the so-called black woman and all women in a lot of music. Have women been objectified, quote unquote, in music? Yes, they have to a degree. But why is it that you see many men objectifying women in music or in music videos? It's because women like to be objectified. And that's something that a lot of people might not like or accept, but it's the truth. Women like to be sexual objects. That's why when summertime comes around, what do women do? The first thing that they do is start to dress as scantily clad as possible. I remember when the rapper Nelly had that video for Tip Drill. The women were complaining. They were alleging that Nelly had no respect for women, especially the scene where he swiped the credit card down the crack of the broad's ass. All of those women in the video were strippers. And they didn't care what Nelly did to them because that was part of their job. Many times you'll see dark-skinned black women claim, oh, well, you know, in these videos, they only have light-skinned women. Then if the rapper has dark-skinned women being sexually objectified, they'll say, oh, look at how they're sexually objectifying women. A lot of the antipathy and the enmity that we see now between men and women, particularly black men and black women in the music world, started in the late 1970s, early 1980s, in the aftermath of the black feminist movement. Because once again, back in the 1970s, 99.9% of the music that was being made was love music. In the late 1970s, after or during the black feminist movement, you have singers like Diana Ross and many other singers who started to talk about what a man needs to be doing for them. Remember Janet Jackson in the 1980s singing, "What Have You Done For Me Lately?" Even Eddie Murphy, he mocked it in his classic comedy special Raw. So the women started it. And what you heard from black males in the music industry, especially in the hip hop world, was a response to women starting to make material items or the materialistic aspect of relationship the most important aspect. So that's how that started. And as usual with men, if you start something with men, they'll take it for a while, and then when they finally respond, they're going to go all out. So that's why I state that this concept of the disrespect of black women in hip hop is really a chicken or egg scenario. And I do believe that a lot of what we see is more of a response than anything else. And on top of that, once you declare yourself an independent woman, basically what you're saying is that you can sleep with however many men you want. You can move on to whoever, whenever you want. That's not going to breed respect. It's just not. So that's part and parcel of the condition of the battle.
And then we just go, oh, and we keep claiming it as our culture. We said, this is rap, it's our culture. And there's so much disrespect for women. And then you look at the relationship between black men and black women, the divorce rate, the illegitimacy rate, and we think there's no connection. We've embraced a culture that has major hostility towards black women.
Well, I think that we have embraced a culture that has major hostility, period. The hostility towards black women is just part and parcel of the overall hostility. If you listen to hip hop in general, it's a hostile music. Once again, it's an offshoot of the crack epidemic. Music is always going to be reflective of the time period in which it was created and the time period of its genesis. Rock and roll music, of course, it came from the jukebox era. So that was a time when so-called blacks would go to, certain dance halls, and the jukebox would play and they would start dancing and so on and so forth. Guy would get on stage with the guitar. Eventually it manifested into rock and roll. Hip hop comes from the street, breakdancing, turntables, MCing. The understanding that essentially the art of rhyme can be used to ensnare the mind of the listener. There's something about rhyming and a person who has the ability to communicate their thoughts in a rhyme pattern that makes that form of music even more enchanting than other forms of music. And that goes back thousands of years. Many of the knights, who were so-called black men, by the way, they would write rhymes about who they killed and how they killed them during the Middle Ages. Particularly one of the ruling families of Scotland, the Black Douglases. Of course, you have Shakespeare and his iambic pentameter. All the way down to today. If you can tell a story through rhyme, that's always going to enrapture the people because it takes a great deal of skill. It also allows them to follow your narrative better. That's why Muhammad Ali used rhyme as a mechanism to market himself throughout the 1960s. He's viewed as being one of the fathers of hip-hop. You know, Ali, he used to go down to the Village in the early 1960s, and he'd go to those beatnik poetry clubs, and he would battle a lot of the poets there. And they didn't even know that they were battling him. He would get on stage, and he would let a poet spit one of their rhymes, and then he would say a rhyme in response to that. And that was back in the early 1960s. A lot of them, those coffee-drinking, goatee-having Caucasians at those poetry coffee shops back then, they didn't know what the hell he was doing. But that was just, hip-hop is kind of an amalgamation of the rhyming from antiquity with something that so-called black people do call playing the dozens, where we just snap on one another. And it just started to develop from there. But just getting back to the point, music is just an offshoot of the environment. And it can also be used for social engineering, which is what hip-hop is being used for today. And it's been used for that since the mid-1980s.
Then we wonder why we're hostile towards each other. And as
To your point, it is possession and pride. Oh, I took your girl. And I was like, dang, I remember that. But this is where I knew it flipped. The B word used to be taboo to women. Now, watch network TV. They call themselves B words.
Well, once again, brother, I can't blame hip-hop for that. One of the main reasons why it's so much easier for women to call one another bitches is because they're shameless. The scriptures tell us in Ecclesiasticus, the 26th chapter, that a shameless woman shall be counted as a dog. So when a woman calls herself a bitch and she calls other women bitches, it's because most modern day women are shameless. Look at how they dress. Look at how they conduct themselves. They have no shame. There was a time period where if a woman was raped by a man, and when I say a time period, I'm talking about during the Middle Ages and prior. If a woman was raped by a man, she would kill herself because of the shame. There was a way that a woman dressed and conducted herself to not dishonor herself or her husband, but particularly her husband. Today, that doesn't exist. A lot of these females are on these jobs, quote unquote married, flirting with men on the job. So I can't blame hip hop for why females conduct themselves how they do. I blame the black feminist movement of the late 1970s. The woman has to be moderated. People might not like that, but that is the case. They have to be moderated. And are there good women who still have honor and respect for themselves? Of course. But in general, most of them are shameless because most of them are Luciferian, i.e. liberal.
Yo, beat them over the head so much with this. Hey, I just had to accept it.
It becomes normal. It becomes normal.
It's
Right.
pornography.
Desensitized.
Anybody that knows me, I'm not anti-porn.
That's the second time you said that, bruh. Once again, that's too much information. We don't need to have that vision of a butt-naked Jason Whitlock in a den looking at some porn website. I'm good.
It's not at the forefront of my culture in any way. And I listen to rap music with a headphone on. You won't catch me out listening with my mother and other people.
The N-word in spin class, y'all need to
You won't catch me online
stop it, man. I hate my
looking at porn with my mother.
Marcellus Wiley still talking about his spin class. You mad because there's a bunch of white people in your spin class talking about nigga? Maybe you need to go to a different spin class, bro.
And it's, one last thing, it's not just rap music either. It's not just rap music either. That's a good conversation,
But we're claiming it as our culture.
That's where I got it.
All right, coming up.
But anyway, that's basically it on that. I thought that was a very good conversation. But once again, if we're going to talk about the genesis of hip-hop and the issues in the so-called black community, it's far bigger than just hip-hop itself. Hip-hop is a tool that has been used to exacerbate many of the issues in the so-called black community, issues that go back many, many decades, even centuries. But that's neither here nor there. Peace.